The idea of the train and the railroads is a reoccurring theme in the folktale and fables of America, from characters dying on the job like John Henry to songs about working on the railroad every day. But why is this idea of building railroads so popular? Has it made such an impact on our American culture? To better understand this question, I will discuss what purpose the railroad system had, how it affected business and politics, and how the American people were affected by the railroad during their golden age. So, why were the railroads built? Around the time that the first transcontinental railroad was built, America had recently acquired land in the western part of the continent, and Americans were starting to settle into the land and create their own infrastructure. However, it took a long time to travel between the east and west with the current methods of transportation. There were still trains, but none of them went far enough to go from one side of the country to the next. With this lack of connection between the east and the west, the country was somewhat separated. Also, each side of the country had their own corporations and companies, and since it was so difficult to get from one side to the next, they stayed mostly local. And, as business usually goes, these companies wanted to expand. The combination of financial and political need for a transcontinental railroad was enough to make it happen. Land grants were given to the railroad companies. Railroad companies sold this land to gain money and worked around the law to maximize the land they could get from the government. This trend of handling the making of railroads continued throughout the golden era of railroads. Businesses in cities that had access to the railroads flourished. Because of this, business and local politics would buy into the railroad companies to get the railroad to come to them and get a station to connect them to it. This is another way that the railroad companies became so wealthy, and their owners became some of the wealthiest men America had ever seen. With all this money pouring in from the trains, the industries that were connected to the rails flourished, such as the steel industry, which actually grew from the need for a stronger material for the rails than iron, which was brittle in comparison. The railroads were at the center of life during the Gilded Age, and so emanated most of its problems: inequality between race and class, poor working conditions, and political corruption from business involvement. In the early stages of building the Transcontinental Railroad, the Irish were the favored workforce. However, there was a labor shortage for the job, and workers were starting to protest to the working conditions and wages. James Harvey Strobridge, superintendent of construction at Central Pacific Railroad, one of the two companies that built the first transcontinental railroad, hired a few Chinese in an attempt to threaten the Irish with getting their jobs taken away in order to be silent. He did not have any initial intentions to continue hiring the Chinese. However, they turned out to be incredibly good workers, and so they ended up being the majority of the workforce. The Irish and the Chinese were not treated with equal respect. The Irishmen were paid $35 a month, while the Chinese were paid anywhere between $27 to $30 a month. Throughout the rest of the Golden Age, the Chinese were the favored workforce. They were fast, efficient, cheap, and usually didn't complain. Among the passengers, there was also racial inequality. Several states had made a law that encouraged rail lines to have segregated seating. Louisiana joined them in 1890, and the law was disputed in Supreme Court in 1896 in the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson debate, but the law remained. Segregation was not outlawed until almost 100 years later. The railroads were a major part of American life in the 19th and early 20th centuries. They were the dominant form of long-distance transportation and a major source of employment. Wealthy businessmen had ties to local and federal governments influencing their policies, With railroads influencing so much, it's no wonder they made such an impact on our culture.